Today we are starting a journey into the heart of another woman, and you will know her as the lovely, very dark Miss Sylvia Plath. Good morning and welcome to Lost for Words. I am Sarah Woods and we are exploring great women poets, and we are leaving behind Emily Dickinson to explore the heart of Sylvia Plath. There is something about her that feels a little bit like stepping into a world that is just a shade or a couple of shades darker. She's an amazing poet. She's an American poet who ended up living in England with her husband, Ted Hughes, who is also a poet. You can tell she has a love for words, a love for really crafting a poem that is significant. I will tell you that, so this is where I'm starting out with Sylvia Plath. Her poetry, there is something about it for me that when I read it, it takes me to a darker place, a more fragile place in myself that I guess I don't know if I truly love to spend a lot of time in that place. And so I feel like there are poems of hers that are powerful and that I relate to, but they're not poems that I particularly want to spend a lot of time relating to. I don't know if that makes any sense. In this journey into Sylvia Plath, I feel like you should know that I'm coming from a perspective that I'm not somebody that romanticizes Sylvia Plath and is ooey gooey over her poetry. I think she has a fascinating story. It's tragic, but very interesting, which to me makes her poetry even more interesting. But I feel like there's a part of me that when I read her poetry, I know it was necessary for her, but there's part of me that wonders, like, what could Sylvia Plath have written if she could have moved beyond those darker shades, those darker shadows where she sort of existed in her poetry. Not that it would have like all of a sudden turned Sylvia Plath into this like flowery, kind of writer, but I don't know. I guess I'm curious what her poetry would have looked like if she had like a strong hope for her future that had lasted. Like, what would it have done to her poetry? I don't know. Do you ever wonder that about people in their art? Like, if they could have changed their perspective, or if something different had happened, like, what would it have done to their poetry? I don't know. So, knowing that about me, I guess as I discover her, I feel like you're going to get to watch my feelings about her poetry maybe unfold. I don't know if I'll like stay in the same exact place, or if I will end up loving her poetry more. I'm not sure. So today we are going to explore a poem that is upon my first sort of gleaning, reading, skimming of Sylvia Plath's poetry is my favorite. I love the rhythm of it, I love the visual imagery of it, and I love that it has a meaning behind it that is interesting and, for me, a little bit, I think, relevant to history and to like where women have been and where they're going. So we're going somewhere a little quiet, a little darker, to a fertile ground for mushrooms. And that is the title of Sylvia's poem. It's Mushrooms. It's number 121 in her collected poems, Sylvia Plath. I'm going to put a copy of this poem in the description. I believe you can press the little arrow and it'll bring it up and you can read along with it while we go through it if you'd like. So that'll be there for you. One thing to notice is that Sylvia Plath, she was somebody who gave her poems titles. If you remember Emily Dickinson, she did not. A lot of her poetry was known for its first lines because she didn't give it titles. Sylvia, on the other hand, from what I can tell, almost all of her poems have titles. And I think it was something she actually wrestled with quite a bit, giving her poems the right name. And it sounds like she would even give one a name and then later change her mind and be like, no, that's not the right name. I need a different name. And that she would even talk to her husband, Ted, like they would brainstorm and think about what to name these poems. So there's something to me about her poetry that makes me feel like they're like little children because she was, because naming them was so important to her, that she was trying to find just the right name to fit their message, their personality. So I don't know. I kind of think of her poems titles like the names of children. Maybe that's kind of weird. I don't know. So, all right, let's begin. Overnight, very whitely, discreetly, very quietly, our toes, our noses take hold on the loam and acquire the air. Nobody sees us, stops us, betrays us. The small grains make room. Soft fists insist on heaving the needles, the leafy bedding. Even the paving, our hammers, our rams, earless and eyeless, perfectly voiceless, widen the crannies, shoulder through holes. We diet on water, on crumbs of shadow, bland-mannered, asking little or nothing. So many of us. We are shelves, we are tables, we are meek, we are edible, nudgers and shovers in spite of ourself, our kind multiplies. We shall by morning inherit the earth, our foot is in the door. Okay, so don't you love where she took us with this poem? I feel like Sylvia Plath just like came and like breathed on our imaginations and like brought this like little world to life in our minds. This place that is dark and quiet and this place where something is growing in the middle of the night and you can hear it. You can hear them pushing up through the pine needles, through the dirt, ever so quietly trying to nudge their way up from under the ground, out into the world. And she says it happens overnight. So this is not something that happens in the daylight in front view of everyone. This is something that is happening while everyone else is asleep. So to me, I'm like, oh, like these sneaky little mushrooms that are growing at night when nobody's there to notice. I kind of like that idea. She says nobody sees us. She describes them growing, and then she describes these mushrooms as perfectly voiceless, which gives even more emphasis on the quietness of this event in this place. So she's talking about night, you know, when everything else is asleep, everything is hushed. It's this quiet time. These little mushrooms are pushing their way up, nudging their way up through the ground, and they're voiceless. So it's kind of interesting. I just suddenly got a vision of sort of like, imagine a baby being born, and it coming out of the mother's womb and it not crying. Imagine that baby coming out quietly with no voice. That is sort of what I'm imagining with these mushrooms that are pushing their way up from the ground. It's like they're being born at night when everything is quiet and they don't even wake anybody up because they're voiceless. And then it says that these mushrooms that, so you imagine a baby, like when a baby's born, like it needs to be fed. And that's the mother's job, to feed it milk. And then as it gets older, it, starts to learn to eat solid food. And then by the time it's grown, it's eating things like steak and cutting with forks and knives and chewing and digesting like real food. But these mushrooms, they live on a diet of water and shadow. So you imagine these little creatures that are born in the dark. They're born without voices, and they survive on rain, which is something that the weather decides when it happens. That's not like being fed by a mother. It's not like an animal that prowls and hunts and gathers its own food. And it dines on shadow. There's something very it's like that survival of the fittest kind of idea, that we're survivors. And these mushrooms are like the truest survivors, because they're like, we can survive on shadow and water. Who else can do that? It's amazing. And she said, we're bland-mannered, asking little or nothing. So many of us. So these little mushrooms, they are sort of bland. They don't have a lot of flavor. And they ask for little or nothing. They don't need much to eat. They don't need daylight. They don't have voices. And they exist basically on the scraps of everyone else, is what it sounds like to me. They don't take up a lot of space. Don't mind us. We'll survive on nothing. It's kind of like this feeling that I'm getting from these mushrooms. It says, we are shelves, we are tables, we are meek. This is where I think you sort of start to realize this poem is a metaphor, and it's a metaphor for a group of people. She's got a we here. This is, she's including herself, and she's including other people. And a lot of people believe that Sylvia Plath has created a metaphor for what it feels like to be a woman, and for her, and how she feels like women act in societies. This is what she is, how she's describing them. So this is kind of a little bit of a feminist poem, which, she died, I think it was in 1963. So she was a little bit a part of that, the beginning movement where women were starting to get into the workplace and make lives for themselves. So she says, we are shelves, we are tables, we are meek. So she sort of switches from, like, we're in the forest, or we're under a tree, or we're outside at night, and suddenly we find ourselves in, or for me anyway, I suddenly find myself in the home, and I'm imagining, a table, a kitchen table, or a shelf on the wall, and it's like there are these objects that are very necessary and important part of everyday life, but they're like, what is that word? Inanimate. Like they don't move, they can't talk, they can't breathe, they can't, they're not living, but they're still a very important part of everyday life. She's compared herself to, and women to like furniture in a home that everybody needs and is useful, but you barely notice and you sort of take for granted. You're always going to have that table. You're always going to have that shelf. It'll always be there to hold your things, to hold your food. And it doesn't mind. A table doesn't mind being there. A shelf doesn't mind being there, doing what it does. And she says, nudgers and shovers, in spite of ourselves, our kind multiplies. We shall by morning inherit the earth, our foot's in the door. So I find the ending of this poem to be kind of humorous for me, because she has just described these mushrooms. They're having to, like these sneaky little mushrooms that have to grow at night. They do their growing in the night after it's rained and while everyone else is sleeping. These voiceless mushrooms that are born into this world with no opinions, no voice, and who can survive on little to nothing, no nutrients. We shall by morning inherit the earth, our foot's in the door. I'm like, all right, Sylvia. Like, it leaves you sort of like, no, like these little mushrooms are not going to inherit the earth. Mushrooms are not, like, they are not going to be the thing that you suddenly see evolving to the top of the food chain. Do you know what I mean? Like, if you're a mushroom, like when you go about your business during the day, if you drive somewhere, if you walk somewhere, like how many mushrooms do you notice? I actually love mushrooms and I notice them if I go on a walk in the forest or in my yard. But I feel like that is very hard to imagine mushrooms inheriting the earth. I find this poem interesting because I feel like anytime you give yourself a metaphor, it's kind of saying, this is how I see myself. Or if you give a metaphor to a whole group of people, to women or to men, or to fathers or mothers, or to races, to like, if you were to give one to like Greeks or Mexicans or African Americans, like whatever metaphor you would give to those people shows how you feel if you're a part of that group of people, or how you see those people, or how you think society sees those people. And so there's something about this poem that I actually find a little bit sad, because it's described women as having to sneak their growth. It's described women as being voiceless. It's described women as like surviving on very little. And so, which I think is interesting, if you were to compare that metaphor to like if she had said, we are trees and we are given lots of space and air, and we grow in the sunlight, and we grow slowly and strongly and sturdy, and we're a place for the birds, and we grow strong branches for children to play on, and we reach for the sky, and we bear fruit for the world, and we last for thousands of years, and then even in our being cut down or falling down, we become homes for, little animals to nest. Like, if she had described women like trees, like, it makes you realize the power of a metaphor, and how you see yourself, and how you move through life. If you see yourself as a mushroom, if you see yourself as somebody who has been pushed into the shadows, who can only do their growth if they're sneaking around, who was born into the world without a voice that matters, who is having to live off the scraps of shadow, I wonder if it matters, like the relationship between men and women, that if she saw them differently, if she saw men as someone or as people that that got to grow in the daylight, that got to feed themselves, like grow and learn and educate themselves and have opinions and have a voice that mattered, and got to move about the world like in a way that was like not sneaky, that they were sort of free. I think whether this has to do with women or it could do with people groups, whether it could do with parent and children, like no matter what the relationship is, I feel like to see yourself as a mushroom is a sad thing. To see yourself as growing in the shadows, to see yourself as voiceless is a sad thing. And it's kind of, if you think about women, the 1960s were a big deal for women. Sorry, I had to go and fix my family's lunch, and now I'm back. Let's get back to Sylvia. So one thing I just want to like sort of focus on is that in Sylvia's lifetime, there was a lot going on with women and things were changing for women. And I think sometimes in some ways change happens fast. Like when they decide all of a sudden a woman can do this, she can do this. But that doesn't mean that everyone else's mentalities and views of women all of a sudden changed with the things like the laws that were changing or what women were allowed to do. Just because a woman was allowed to go do it doesn't mean that everybody maybe in her family like supported those things or that her husband supported those things. So you've got like generations of views held of women that I feel like take time to sort of grow into something more healthy. But think about it, when Sylvia Plath was born, she was born in the 1930s. 1920 is when women got the right to vote. So she was born like 12 years after women got the right to vote. So that was changing around the time she was born. Let's see. In the 1960s, women got the right to have their own bank account without the permission of their husbands. That's a big deal. And then like 1967, the same decade that Sylvia Plath took her life, Catherine Switzler, she ran the Boston Marathon. She was the first woman to run the Boston Marathon. They had like 70 years of all men runners running the Boston Marathon. And she sort of snuck in. She was the little, the mushroom, what did we say? Overnight, very whitely, discreetly, very quietly. She was a sneaky little mushroom. She filled out her entry form with her initials so they wouldn't know she was a woman, because she wanted to run. But then she got into the race, and the men in the race were supporting her. It sounded like they had like good attitudes about her being there. They were happy she was there. They thought it was great. But then like an older generation, a man that had started the race, he was riding on his little truck and saw her in the race, and it made him furious. He jumped off the back of the truck and like attacked her, trying to rip off her number, yelling at her to get out of his race. Her boyfriend, who was a football player, tackled him, knocked him over, and she finished the race, which is amazing. So I kind of like to think of her, Catherine Switzler, as like a little mushroom that was sneakily growing in the middle of the night. And she, but what that woman did is she created a space for women to do something in the light and not have to be sneaky. Now women are allowed to run in the Boston Marathon, and it's not a big deal. So yeah, when Sylvia Plath wrote this poem was it was 1959, so it was right before the 60s. It was.
And when you look at these ads from her time, you can really capture the energy and pressure for a woman to find her joy in pleasing her husband by bringing him food, by being domestic, by cleaning and taking care of her family. Really like this feeling of being there to please him and serve him and to support him. And you can also feel a pressure to please men with our bodies, with our looks, visually. So there's just an overall pressure to serve, to please, and to be what men want us to be, so that we can support them and that they'll love us and be happy with us and take care of us. But you can also feel another tension in some of the Playboy ads that were very popular about what kind of men read Playboy. They have these powerful, important men who have multiple women sort of admiring them and gazing at them longingly. But it sort of makes me wonder if the thing they're gazing at is the man, or if it's his power and his position and his lifestyle that they crave more than they actually crave him. So I feel like I can kind of see how Sylvia Plath could relate women to mushrooms, because if a woman's whole existence is in taking care of and pleasing someone else and being what someone else needs and wants, that is a life in the shadows. It makes me think, it's been about 60 years since Sylvia Plath wrote this poem. It makes me wonder if she were alive today, if she would feel differently about who women are, and if she would feel like the mushrooms did it. The mushrooms are inheriting the earth. They have got their foot in the door. Or if she would write us a new metaphor.
Also, what do you think Sylvia's metaphor for how she viewed men was? Do you think she viewed men as mushrooms also? Or do you think she had a different metaphor for men in her life? How she viewed them, how she felt about them. And then I think the main thing that I would like to leave you with this video is, if there is an ideal metaphor for like a healthy human, like what do you think it is? Like what would be the ideal, in your mind, metaphor for the human experience and what it looks like? And I think that's where I'm going to leave this. I don't think I'm going to go too far into this and too crazy, because we've got more of Sylvia Plath to discover. And with that, I will leave you. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I will see you again next week. Goodbye.